Hello and welcome to episode 11 of the Aquarius Podcast. I'm your host, Randy Reed. For those of you that follow the show on Facebook or Instagram, you may have noticed my pictures from the Greater Seattle Aquarium Society annual auction that was held on Saturday, April 21st. This auction was amazing. I couldn't have guessed that we would have close to 900 items for sale in the auction. Items range from guppies, plecos, African cichlids, Caridina shrimp, which I'm sure had to be some of the highest priced items there that went for sale, to old aquarium books, plants upon plants upon plants, to a few hodgepodge box of stuffs. This auction even had a wonderful piece of original artwork from one of the founding GSAS members. I guess if I had to give perspective, it was like a regular monthly auction times 10. Not only did I snag great deals on crypts, Vallisneria, and driftwood, but I was also able to engage with the auction by volunteering to be an item runner for close to an hour. And I certainly wasn't the only one to do so. There was a healthy rotation of people flowing through this job, so no one person had to spend the entire auction running items. So, your first step is to attend a Fish Club auction. Your second step is a challenge. Volunteer to run some items and help the auction be that much smoother. And hey, when you run items, you also get an up-close look at something you may wish to bid on. So before we get on to the interview, I would like to thank everyone who has subscribed, liked, or is following this podcast. If you aren't already doing so, please like and follow the Aquarius Podcast Facebook page as well. For those who have created a Podbean account just to follow this show, a big thank you to you all as well. Now on to the interview. Today's date is Tuesday, April 10th, 2018. My guest today is Heather Burke. Heather is a passionate aquarist and keeper of a wide variety of animals, from cockroaches to snakes. Heather has also worked several years in retail fish stores, having helped run quarantine apartments among many other responsibilities. She also enjoys getting out into nature and catching local native fish in her home state of Michigan. In addition, she has also shared her knowledge with other fish keepers by speaking at fish clubs in the U.S. and Canada. Heather, welcome to the Aquarius Podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much for taking the time to come on the show and talk about your background and experience in the hobby. So you definitely have a really cool list of things and accomplishments that you've done, and I definitely want to dig in and talk about some of these items. So I guess, where did it all start for you? So how did you get involved in the tropical fish hobby?
Yeah, so for me, the hobby, a lot of people, they get started like their parents or someone they know keeps fish, and that kind of rubs off on them. But for me, it was very self-driven, and my interest in fish stems from an interest in all animals, and I learned that I could sort of get away with keeping lots of fish tanks. But it started out, I think, I want to say it was a goldfish bowl, and then it was a betta bowl early in my childhood. We just kind of won, prizes at the fair, and I didn't think a whole lot of it. And then one day I kind of revisited that when I was with my sister at like the local supermarket that also sold fish. And I remember specifically conning her into buying me a fantail goldfish. And it was really cheap, and she was always better with money than I was as a kid. She always kind of had a little stash, and I was like, hey, wouldn't it be cool if we had this little goldfish? And it's kind of from that little con that I sort of introduced fish into the household. And then I kind of, I took over, even though I kind of convinced her to buy that fish. It was my fish. It only lasted for about a week. And then I started I started hitting the books. I went to the library and checked out about every book imaginable on fish, and sort of taught myself how to do better next time. And when I was 12, I got my first actual fish tank, I think after my dad realized that I had this really keen interest. And so when we started going back to the supermarket, I would go back and look at the fish again, and I would just be like identifying all these random fish that are in with the feeder fish, and thinking about how I could set up a tank of mosquito fish, gambusia, which aren't glamorous fish by any means, but they were definitely cool to me. I just started developing this really keen interest and eye for fish, and my dad recognized that and sort of gifted me like a 5.5 gallon tank, which was my first actual like aquarium, not like a bowl. We got like I want to say we had like an internal filter. It wasn't like a sponge. It was like one of those cheap ones that like has like a little bit of carbon. It is run through anyway, it was a neat little setup, but it wasn't until I was 13 that I kind of got my first like proper setup, and it was a 29-gallon tank that I think my dad's been kind of instrumental in getting me going on the hobby, even though he wasn't necessarily a fish hobbyist himself. The 29-gallon tank is kind of where my first accidental spawns happened. And from there, I started getting into like tropical fish hobbyist magazines. And then I started looking into the back of those magazines, and they'd have like a directory on where the local fish clubs and state by state. And I found, I distinctly remember the moment when I found the Southwestern Michigan Aquarium Society in Michigan. And I thought, well, this isn't too far. And then I got online, you get the dial-up going, and you get on the internet and you look it up, and sure enough, they've got like a meeting site, and they've got a date and a time for the next meeting for the month. And I remember kind of exciting, like logging off the internet, and then taking the phone, the landline, because we didn't have cell phones. And I want to say this was like 2005, 2006, and called up my dad and kind of like begged him to take me to the meeting. And I guess the rest is history. And I showed up, and it was kind of crazy because, being that I was about 14 at the time, and I'm a young female. My dad just dropped me off in this like technology room in this college in Kalamazoo, and I show up early, and I'm not really sure what I'm doing, where I am, but I'm just kind of waiting for the action to start. And then slowly see all these kind of older men trickle in, and realize kind of, oh, okay, I guess there's not really a lot of people my age. But it didn't deter me, and I was, some of my best friends, stemmed from that. And yeah.
Do you remember what the talk was the night of your first fish club meeting?
I don't remember. It's really sad. I want to say amongst some of my first talks, there was a talk on Pelvica chromis, the genus. But that particular night, I think the thing that really caught my attention was that there's these things called mini auctions, and everyone comes in and brings in their bags of fish every month that they auction off, that are either spawns that they're witnessing, getting points for. So it's kind of like this competition that's ongoing, and people are trying to get their spawns recognized and then be breeder of the year or whatever. But for me, it was like coming in and, oh, there's fish here, and they're on the table, and they were so cheap. And it was like, I think that night I bought a $2 bag of Iliodon furcidens, which, for those unfamiliar, is actually kind of an ugly, depends on who you ask, but it's a gadiid. It's not the nicest fish.
Yeah, I want to thank you for, recently I've been trying to plug joining your local fish club, so that's a part of my outro, and any chance I get to say that people need to join their local fish club, very early on in this episode, you just gave me that opportunity talking about the auctions. Again, if you are not a part of your local fish club and you have one in your area, you're that fortunate enough to have one in your area, because some people, there aren't any fish clubs. You really, really want to join, so you can talk to all the fish nerds in your area, but then also take part in the really fun auctions after, and buy some plants and buy the spawns. Very, very inexpensive. Unless a guest speaker brings something super exotic, then that may go for, a pretty penny. But for the most part, you're going to get fish much cheaper than you would in the retail store. So thank you, Heather, for giving me that chance to plug.
Oh, yeah, totally.
to plug joining your local fish club.
Yeah, but it's true that when you're talking about, how I got into the hobby, there's kind of a blur of like what I did before the fish club and then everything that happened after. And it was so much growth once I joined the club, and it was it was awesome because people enable you. Once you start getting that multiple tank syndrome, people are like, oh, I got these tanks you can have, or they'll sell them to you really cheap, or next thing I know, I had 20 tanks in my bedroom as in high school. So it's
I will say one of the biggest problems though with the auctions is you don't necessarily have enough tank real estate for what you want to buy and what you may be bidding on. So I've actually bid on some fish that I lost, and I was actually kind of glad that I did because I didn't have a tank set up for them. So, but it was just you get caught up in the moment of the auction, and you're like, oh, I want that fish, but you're not really thinking, and yeah, you're not.
Fish is a different story. I just mean like for some reason I was able to blow up from like 1 or 2 tanks to all of a sudden 20. And then once I got to college, and then actually was able to live off campus and have my own sort of space for fish tanks again. Dorms don't necessarily let you keep like 20, 30, 40 fish tanks.
Well, I think there's I think there's a critical mass. Like once you get so many tanks, whoever you're living with, whether it's your parents or your significant other, if they're not in the hobby and they're not counting how many tanks you have exactly, like once you get beyond, I don't know, 6, 7 tanks, they all start to look the same, and it all starts to blend, and it's just this massive aquarium. So then you can sneak in 1 or 2 extra aquariums and they don't notice.
Yep, absolutely. That's totally what I did. I think one of my funnier moments was I brought home I went to Meijer, which is the superstore or a supermarket I was talking about earlier, but it's local to Michigan. It's like in Michigan, Indiana. Anyway, brought home a thick tote, and this was a storage tote, and I'm like, yep. And I stuck it in the car, and then I get home, and it's a quarantine tank now.
Yeah,
on the floor in my room.
It doesn't have to be pretty. I mean, we'll talk about quarantine tanks a little bit later, but yeah, I mean that's a very good point. If it's going to be something that's temporary, as long as your filter media is good, yeah, you can use that as a quarantine tank. So I want to take a step back. And you said what was your first breeding accident that you said? Your first spawn?
Yeah, I kind of alluded to that. So that was another definitely what motivated me to seek out the fish clubs and the local aquarium societies in general. It's just once I started having fish that were having babies, then I was like, well, I can breed all these fish. And I don't know, it was like a switch flip, like in my head. It was like suddenly there was all these new things I could explore with fish, and suddenly it was, I could watch the development of all these various fishes. But yeah, the first spawns were accidental, and I want to say my first fish I put in the tank was like a molly, and she dropped her fry like over like the next couple of days. She dropped some fry. I think I was out of town. My dad sent me I think he called me and was like, so there's like these little fish in here, and I was away, and I was like, what? And I was freaking out, and then I think because I was out of town, my dad didn't really know what to do with them. But then, I had some platies in there, and they started having babies. And so live bears were definitely an easy first accidental spawn. But the one that really sticks out to me was that I had zebra danios accidentally spawn in my community tank. And I think that's what led me down the path where now I talk about danios a lot. Specifically because I just really, really loved these fish. And if you never spawn like an egg scattering fish, their fry are unrecognizable when you first see them. So, I went from looking at these little teeny liveberry fry to all of a sudden I was looking at my tank one day, and there was like this little sliver, little black, like little line on the side of the tank. And I remember staring at it, and one of the adult female zebra danios came up. I know she was female because she was really fat. And came up and snapped it off the glass. And then I realized I wasn't seeing things. There was something there that she just ate. From then on, I started experimenting a little bit, and I was finding more fry. And I was trying to set out to raise them, but it was totally accidental. And those are, I don't know, they're just such an awesome group of fish.
So what else is it about the zebra danios that you really like?
Yeah, so I mean, getting them in the first place, I think, was just like a power of suggestion thing. I think my dad, while he wasn't really a fish hobbyist, had mentioned in passing that he looked after a friend's fish tank in college, and that tank had zebra danios, and he always liked those. And I was like, oh, okay. So when I went to like Petco or something to get most of my first fish, I was like, all right, let's get some zebra danios in there. And, they're kind of subtle, but they're very beautiful when you look at them. Even being as common of a fish as they are, there's a reason they've been in the hobby as long as they have. And even to the extent where they're like one of the most popular model organisms for aquatic animals. Like if you go to, any university, like there's going to be labs that use these fish. They're just ubiquitous. They're everywhere. But the males are this kind of goldish color when they're mature, and the females are very silvery, and they've got these just awesome blue stripes. But I think the best thing, they're schooling fish. You don't have to deal with much aggression when it comes to danios. Sometimes they can chase things around a little bit, but for the most part, they're a very peaceful group of fish. They can work in a lot of tanks. And I think it was my following spawns when I started working with Celestichthes, which is they were grouped as danio at one point. Celestichthes margaritatus, the celestial pearl danio, which that became my favorite fish of all time. And I got it right around the time I was, I want to say 15 or 16, right when they were like new to the hobby. And that really hooked me once I started working with those fish. And then I wanted erythromicron. And then I started wanting other, like fire. I ended up with fire ring danios pretty early on, spawned them, pearl danios. I think I just learned from an early point, in an early stage of my hobby and my journey as a hobbyist, that these were very easy to spawn fish. They spawn in large numbers most of the time. Margaritatus, Celestichthes genus in general being kind of an exception because they're so small, but and also they're maybe a little different, but they're still kind of grouped with the danios.
So let's say I wanted to get, because I've never kept any of the danios, and it's definitely a fish that's on my list of something that I would like to keep. But let's say somebody out there listening already has some danios. So I guess my first question would be, and you've alluded to it a little bit, is the breeding, how you spawn them, how you care for them, I guess the husbandry to go beyond just having this really cool schooling fish and wanting to actually have successful spawns. Is it kind of the same across? And then I guess whether it is or not, I guess if you could kind of walk through what a successful tank setup looks like, and then maybe what the steps are once you get eggs, or once you get, you start seeing wigglers.
Absolutely. So when I was saying the first accidental spawns, I think the reason that the fry started showing up. So that was a situation where I just had them in a community tank, and I wasn't trying to breed them, and they were overwhelming the system with fry, I guess. A lot of times if you have a heavily planted tank, with a lot of these species, fry just appear. Danios are very popular for like patio ponds. People usually put giant danios because you can still kind of see them because they're good size, but then they just reproduce. And then the fry just sort of appear. But a lot of times, because they're an egg scattering fish, and because they're also, as I was describing with my first experience finding a fry, very eager to eat their own fry. They're, pretty typical fish in the sense that they're not going to take care of them. So a lot of times when you're setting up these spawns, you want to have a way to trap the eggs, whether that's a grate, whether that's marbles, or what, in my case, it was just coarse gravel. That the eggs were able to fall between the crevices, and then the fish were unable to go back and extract them and eat them.
How about a yarn spawning mop? Is that, because I use a floating yarn mop for rainbow fish. Could you do the same without the floating aspect of it, or do you need what you described?
So the thing you do want either a moss or a mop or some sort of vegetation, or whether it be fake or real, doesn't super matter to the fish. But what they're going to do is they're going to spawn around it, and they're going to kind of use that as like their sort of like checkpoint. This is where we're going to release the eggs, but they're not going to actually stick to the mop, to the moss. It's going to fall, and you may have a few that kind of fall amongst the moss, and they don't turn around and eat them right away. But those are most likely to get eaten. So it's the ones that fall underneath whatever the trap, the grate. If they fall in between marbles, between coarse ice, what I love to do is I love to just get that like pea gravel that they sell and the lawn care garden centers, especially around springtime. So this is a great time to pick up. You do have to wash it really, really well, but it's cheap and it's a good size. And then I'm not talking like ripper cobble, like just pea gravel. And that's what I use for a lot of my spawning. I would just use species only tanks. Because when they're in communities, obviously if the parents aren't going to eat the fry, then you have catfish that might eat the fry, or you have tetras that might eat the fry. So, but there is, so the one thing worth mentioning is that a lot of these fish, they're probably not going to get rich spawning them. That's one of the things I think that sort of drew me also, was when I realized that you go to any of these auctions, these club meetings and things, and you notice that there's lots of cichlids, there's lots of live bears, but there's really no representation in the Cyprinidae family. You might get a few goldfish, you might get a few random loaches or some hillstream loaches because, people can get money for them. But if you have a bag of zebra danios, like they're mass produced by, thousands, millions, and they can cost, dimes, pennies, to whoever, to suppliers. So it's not economical. It's not going to make you rich to breed them, but there's really not a representation of it in the hobby. And so that was something that made me want to talk about them, well, why is that?
Now, even though they maybe they didn't command like the highest price at an auction or in a retail setting, but to me, I feel like the demand is still there though, because it is a community fish, and it's something that somebody can buy just for the the sake of, hey, I can at least buy something at this auction that isn't a super aggressive African cichlid or this particular Southeast Asian fish that needs a pH of like 4, right? It needs just like straight acid. So at least if you want to get into fish breeding, and I think this is kind of the model I'm taking when I call things like my breeding for Karma Tank, is that I just want to breed for the fun of breeding. I honestly I thought I was maybe going to try to take some fish in just for store credit to help me out buying food, but honestly, like I think I'm going to go more and just do donations to my local fish club auction, and just to have fun for the sake of breeding. But what I'm getting at is I want to make sure though that I'm breeding things that people are actually going to want, even if it's a low price. Like I've seen cichlids in my local club auction go, $1. Nobody took these cichlids for $1 because they're just not popular in my area.
Yeah.
And it's really it's a tougher fish, where if you're doing zebra danios or even guppies, like those are when they're non-aggressive community fish, it's so easy to get somebody to take those off your hands.
Oh yeah, everyone can use them. I mean, they are useful as dithers. I tell people that when I give my Danio talk, is besides the satisfaction of having your own massive school of fish that you produced, homegrown. So a lot of times I'll mention in my talks that zebra danios are great dither fish for one. There's pretty much anyone can use them in some capacity, whether it's to distract their cichlids or just to appreciate them on their own or to put in the tank for their kid. Yeah, I think that's totally true. And I think there is, something to be said about general public getting involved in these auctions and showing up and they're taking home something and they're not realizing, hey, this fish is going to beat up everything in my tank. But yeah, there's always a market for them. That's something I always emphasize too. And there are species that do command higher dollar, especially with the popularity of nano tanks. If you have like the celestial pearl danios, those are consistently really good sellers. And they're not hard to raise. And they breed very readily, and they're just a beautiful fish. And then there's, my thing is I seek out like all these oddball species, and for the right buyer, I mean, they're worth something.
Yeah, totally. And now, I'm sorry, I distracted you there and got you a little bit off topic. So on the breeding of the zebra danio, so once we set up a system to collect the eggs, are you then pulling them, or are you leaving them in there to hatch out?
I usually pull them. So there's a few ways you can do it. You could just do the lazy method and just have your tank so full of plants that the fish can barely move, and then they're fry that they can't get. And they just appear, and you're not going to get like the largest yield that way, but you will get fry if you just let them appear sometimes. But what I usually do is I usually take a siphon to the coarse gravel or marbles, and I'll siphon them out. And that's kind of my cheap way of doing it. I didn't really have any fancy altered setups with like these nice false bottoms or something, and then they just drop off. I know people who do that, and I think that that's an awesome way to do it too. But either way, you're going to have to either remove the parents or remove the fry. It's one or the other.
And then typically, so once you've pulled the eggs, then, I mean, to me, that sounds like the more preferred method, especially if somebody doesn't have, too many tanks to be moving around, full-size adult parents. Yeah.
I don't like disrupting. So the thing about danios is they'll breed periodically. I mean, pretty frequently. Like they'll just go for like days at a time. And I don't really like to interrupt that, Sometimes they'll have like one really, really massive spawn. And that sort of leaves them spent for a little while, in which case just pulling them and then letting the fry come out is awesome. But if you're getting like lots of little spawns, especially with like celestial pearl danios is a great example. I'll keep bringing up that fish, but
it's a cool fish.
Any of the smaller, it's my favorite fish, but any of the smaller danios, the tin one eye, the gold rings, is a common name, or chopre, glow light danios, they all tend to have smaller numbers. And so I like to let them just kind of go every day or so. And then when I feel like pulling eggs, I'll pull eggs. And it's usually pretty consistent. You can find usually a few. It can be a little more labor intensive. I usually, siphon into a bucket and then get a turkey baster and a flashlight and some kind of Tupperware. And I just sort of baste, like you'll kind of let all the detritus kind of swirl in the middle. And then you'll kind of shine a light. And usually in the first pass, you can tell if there's eggs or if there's wigglers. If there's wigglers, so like up until they're about 4 or 5 days of age, they can be collected safely. Once they're past that stage, they're going to be free swimming, which means they're going to get eaten most likely. So once they're like scooting around and when they're wiggling in the gravel and just they're usually kind of down low, and you can get them out and you can tell right away there's movement. But when there's eggs and they're fresh eggs, sometimes they're small, sometimes the detritus obscures it. Take a turkey baster, put it into the Tupperware container, shine a light, try to blind yourself, and have fun.
How many days do the eggs take to go from hatch to wigglers? Or I'm sorry, to go from a spawn to wigglers?
Oh, yeah. They usually hatch in 24, 48 hours. And then it'll take, when they hatch, they're wigglers, pretty much. And then the next stage is free swimming. So when I would see the fry in that first tank when I had them spawn in the community tank, a lot of times they were stuck to the glass. I kind of observed like early on with these fry that they would kind of hang on the side of the glass. At least when they first hatch out, their movements are every now and again. I mean, if you think of wigglers like cichlids and stuff like that, they'll kind of rest and then wiggle around. And that's kind of what these danio fry do. But I noticed that if you turn off all the lights in the tank and then wait like a half an hour and turn them back on, that's when I would see like all the fry like lined up on the side of the glass. And that was kind of cool. I don't think that helps you collect them that much, but at least to know they're there.
Yeah, that's a neat observation.
Yeah.
And then, so what kind of, do you just have then the wigglers or the eggs that you collect off in like a smaller 5-gallon tank, and then you're just kind of rearing them up from there, like a grow out, if you will?
Yeah. So my method, it's pretty simple, but basically, when I'm collecting eggs, I'm kind of using like an eyedropper or a syringe. So I have my turkey baster to get like a bunch of the detritus, and then I sort through it with like, this sounds like a lot of work, but I really love doing this. But so maybe it's not for everybody, but definitely if you're pulling out only like the healthy eggs, and you'll know if they're not healthy because they'll just be completely white, fungus, whatever. But I noticed with the danios, you don't get a lot of that. A lot of them are fertilized and good. And as long as that's the case, I put them in like a smaller Tupperware container. I label what they are. Like I take a Sharpie and I'll just write what it is. We're talking like those really small, like those Ziploc containers that are, they're small.
Yep.
They don't need to be huge, and then you just keep them at room temperature. I just keep them on the shelf, like where they're not gonna get knocked over. Like I used to have like a little closet and shelves, and then I put them on kind of a row there, and I would write the date, and I would just go back and check them. And when they hatched out and were wriggling, I'd dump them into a tank, usually like a 2.5 gallon. If there weren't like a ton. If there were a ton, 5, 10.
And last, I guess we'll just cover feeding. So what's the initial, once they get past the wiggler stage, what are you then feeding the free swimming?
Yeah, so once they're past wiggling and they're about usually 5 to 6 days of age, post spawn, is once they'll start accepting food. Usually I'll do like a very fine powdered or like a suspension, golden pearls are like my go-to. Usually anywhere from like the 50 to 100 micron. If you go much higher than that, they can't, a lot of the species starting out, at least the first, few days of feeding, can't seem to tackle it as well. Some people use like hard-boiled egg yolk where you can kind of like pinch it a little bit in the water, so it's like it gives off this kind of milky, these little particles are kind of like suspended in the water column. You can use infusoria, paramecium, but yeah, my go-to is always golden pearls.
I agree with you. That's what I've used for the rainbow fry when they're super tiny. The golden
Great
pearls.
stuff.
I mean, it's just ready to go. You keep it in the fridge to keep it fresh, and the rainbow fry have just gobbled it up, and now they're on decapsulated brine shrimp. So I can't say enough good things about golden pearls, and it's made it so I could keep a very difficult small fry and be able to successfully raise them up without having any like of the super small live cultures or anything like that.
I did culture lots of microworms, and I did vinegar eels, and I never really hatched brine shrimp myself personally, because I found that like either instant brine or frozen brine, baby brine, that is, worked pretty well in a lot of cases.
Yeah, so far I can't complain with either one. Golden pearls and decapsulated brine shrimp, and even in the show notes, if you guys are interested, I'll put links to the 2 that I purchased, and if you want to give them a shot, I'd highly recommend it. So Heather, I'm very interested to know about catching wild native fish in Michigan. So can you walk me through what that's all about and what that entails?
Yeah. So yeah, I know you follow my Instagram, so you see a lot of posts of these darters or these minnows that I caught today, and it's been like every weekend for the past 2 weeks that I've tried to go out. It's kind of like that's my zen. I love to do it, but it's you pay. So basically, as long as you have an all species permit, and you have a nice pair of waders and a dip net, you're pretty much good to go. You do have to kind of be careful about where you go. I kind of like the idea of just going out there and being able to find, catch your own fish kind of thing. Like that's just super awesome. Like some people fish for their food, and I fish for my aquariums. So, my love of danios kind of translates to all minnows. So shiners, chubs, and darters are, kind of like a little minnow of their own kind. All really beautiful fish that are just pretty easy to access. If you can fish there, for the most part, you're fine to collect there. You do probably want to be aware of what are restricted things, what you can and cannot take. A lot of times with these permits, it's just a basic fishing license to all species. You're not allowed to take baby game fish. So if you see like small bluegill, if you see small bass, you should put those back. If there are certain species that are like protected, there aren't a ton where I am, but there's like certain bases and things like that you kind of want to be aware of, because you don't want to get caught taking an endangered animal. As long as what you're going after is considered a bait fish, you're not going to get in trouble.
Have you ever had actual like game fishermen come up to you and think that you're catching fish to use as bait? And have they ever tried to buy any off you?
No, that's never happened. I have had times where, I think the stupidest thing that ever happened, it was like right after a fresh rain in like the Red Cedar in Lansing where I am. It's kind of known for being a more polluted river, being that it's runs through the capital of the state. And in the past it was a very industrial place. So it's not always the nicest one to jump into as far as rivers are concerned. But I just remember I went in like after a rain, so the water level was kind of stupid high, and I was like, all right, I probably shouldn't be doing this, but I was kind of poking around, and a lot of times I'll kind of take these sort of areas off of like a bike trail or like a walking, like a hiking path or something like that. And I think one time there was like these fishermen that came up, and they were trying to catch something. They're like, "What are you doing?" And I was like waist deep in the water, like I wasn't really lying what I was doing, because it was just I don't think they were interested in bait, but I think they were kind of looking at me funny because there's this girl waist deep in this kind of dirty river right after a rainfall, which is, by the way, kind of the worst time to go. Not just because it's more dangerous if the water level's higher, but also because a lot of times after a fresh rain, it'll wash like bacteria like E. coli and stuff into the river. So you want to I usually give it a few nice sunny days post rain before I jump in.
That's a pro tip right there. So if you want to do this in your local neighborhood or your local area after a rain, give it a couple days. Let that E. coli wash away. Good time.
You just want the system to process it.
Yeah. So then you have a tank currently set up right now with some of these native Michigan fish?
Yeah, I have a few. So right now, I'm living in an area, where I'm currently staying. My kind of preferred place to put fish tanks is kind of a lot of people like the basement. And the problem with where I am right now is my basement is really cold and it's not well insulated, and I can crank the heat up all I want, but it's not going to do much for the basement. So like in the winter, and lately it's been like the highs have been like 62, 63 degrees. So native fish are kind of perfect for it. So yeah, I do. I have, I want to say a couple 30 gallons, a few 20 longs, a couple 10 gallons with just minnows. You can catch killifish, which is kind of cool. So I've got a few native killies and some mad toms.
Yeah, that's awesome. So do you ever have any success breeding the native fish? And once you breed them, is that something that you would take to your local fish clubs? Or I guess
that's a good, okay, so that's a good point to make.
That seems like a very narrow band of buyers that would be interested in purchasing the native fish.
Well, the problem is it's illegal to sell native fish.
Ah, okay.
So this is very much for personal enjoyment. I will say this time of year is a great time to get in the river because a lot of fish are in spawning mode, given that spring is here. I mean, we think. They think a little bit. They get all colored up and they're ready to go. I know a lot of people, what they'll do is they'll catch gravid female darters and brightly colored males, and this can go for minnows too that are in the mood and they're already ready to go. So you just put them in a tank and let them do their thing. I have not personally had a lot of time to do this, but I really, really want to. And I just last weekend caught some nice green side darters, and I'm hoping I can trick into spawning for me.
That's great. I think I'm going to have a request for some Instagram photos. Heather, you need to show off some of these cool native tanks and some of the native fish that you're catching. I think
sounds good. Yeah,
people would be really interested in seeing that. Yeah, there's a native fish that I read about, and it was in Amazonas magazine last month, the Barron's top minnow. And it's this really beautiful, at least the male is like this really beautiful green color. It's only found in like 3 or 4 spots in the Tennessee high plateau or whatever the geographic part was. But it hasn't been put in the endangered category yet, but it's very much at risk. And I really want to get my hands on a pair of those. I think the only people that have them right now, aside from if you go onto somebody's private property where one of these water sources is, it's like the Tennessee, the Tennessee Aquarium and some of the other like more official artificial bodies actually have some breeding stock, and they're breeding them and releasing them back into the wild. But I think it's the mosquito fish that's out competing them, and they're the native mosquito fish in their native area.
Yeah.
But I really want to try to get my hands on some of those and try to breed them and share them around here in my area, so that, worst case scenario, it's not just like one or two places in Tennessee that have them. And if something happens and it crashes, hey, you've got some in Washington State, and there's a handful of collectors up here, or aquarists that also have these fish. So maybe we'll do let's do a joint road trip to Tennessee and see if we can't go get some of those.
Yeah, you can buy like a like a day permit or whatever, and you can go and collect. And if you're driving, it's a little easier to transport them back. If you're flying, which I did, I went to Florida and collected some fish, and I snuck them in my socks in my suitcase.
I don't think anybody from TSA is listening to this, so maybe you're safe.
No, it was perfectly legal. I asked, and what I did is I used breather bags, and as long as they're, I think I want to say 100 milliliters, it has to be like whatever the volume of liquid is that you're allowed to take. It has to be that volume.
Interesting.
So you'd have like one fish in each bag. I mean, it wasn't, I don't know. It's not advised. Definitely if you're driving, it's a lot easier than transporting for transporting. But the thing about native fish is that if it's native to your state, you cannot sell them, but you can give them to your friends.
Yeah, again, I mean, going back to my karma philosophy on this, I mean, it would be, especially for this fish, it would be, hey, like, this thing is endangered. It's one thing to help breed a, native to Brazil fish or a native to Indonesia or something like that, but something native to the United States that we could potentially help out and breed and spread around. I think that's really cool. So yeah, I got to try to get my hands on some of those. To kind of shift into some of your experience, to wrap this episode up in the quarantine room, and then maybe pivot and see what are some of the tips and tricks that you would give to people to keep their fish healthy at home. So I guess, what was your experience like, helping to run a quarantine room in a large pet store?
So I think, for me, that shaped a lot of my interest in fish health in general. So I would run the quarantine, at least the freshwater side, every weekend and as needed on weekdays when the regular weekly guy or weekday guy was out, which happened fairly frequently. So I was always kind of back there, and this is a very, very busy pet store. And it's kind of nice. It was nice, at least working there, to kind of be able to go at my own pace a little bit and focus on the fish. And you would see all these different, these issues that would come up, especially when you're looking at retail, especially when you're looking at fish that have just been shipped in from all over. You get all sorts of things. And for me, I always wanted to kind of tackle that issue. I wanted to figure out, what do you do when this happens? So it informed a lot, at least it informed kind of my own, how I treat my own fish at home sort of methods. And it was great. It was a great experience. That, all things considered, that being said, there were definitely disastrous weekends. You come in and there'd be a lot of dead fish that had just been shipped in, and overnight you might lose half the batch, or you might lose all of them for whatever reason. You kind of see a lot of really interesting things.
Yeah, I mean, it gives you the opportunity to, try different methods of treating fish, where in your home aquarium, I don't want to say the fish in your quarantine room are guinea pigs, because you want to care for them, but at the same time, it's maybe it's a little bit of a different scenario, right? And the fact that you're doing it as a part of your job.
So you kind of refine the method over time. So like what would happen is that over time you would learn what works for different fish. And so when we're talking about the quarantine room, we're talking about like this kind of back room. There's probably about maybe just shy of 100. Probably. God, I wish I had an exact count. I want to say there's like 40 or so tanks, maybe a little more. But so you have all this tank space, and it all drains from the bottom, and it has like it's plumbed, and then you can refill with water that's been aged and primed and all that. But yeah, over time you would learn what worked for this fish and what worked for that fish, and you kind of developed like a method. And so the quarantine room doesn't even house all of the fish that get shipped in, just because some of them don't handle that well. Some of them don't like bare bottom tanks. Some of them need their pH matched to a specific. So a lot of blackwater fish, when they come in, like cardinals and rummy nose, discus, things like that, typically we would acclimate sales floor, but we would have like specific tanks that would be I know with the cardinals, because their pH would come in so low, they would get shocked and die if you put them in like 7 pH, which is very neutral. So we would check what their pH of water is that they came in, and then we try to match the water they're going in, and we'd add things like vinegar to kind of like bring it down, you know.
Well, I don't think I've ever heard of any stores going through that effort. I mean, in maybe other stores do this, but that seems like, you know, you're really going above and beyond to make sure that this fish has a good acclimation.
Yeah. So that was this is Bruce Pets in Lansing that I worked for about 3 years, and a lot of my time was either in the breeding room because they produce a lot of their fish, at least a certain. So they either produce the fish that don't ship well, or they are trying to, so they don't have to ship them in at all, or they're trying to eliminate the problems with the fish that do get shipped in, they definitely do a lot for the customers in terms of the fish health.
Do you have one or two species of a fish that doesn't ship well that they would breed in house? Oh
yeah, and all the angels. For the most part, there's like a virus that a lot of them that are imported tend to have, and if it gets to your angelfish, like the healthy ones that you have, like they all kind of catch it. It's like the thing about viral diseases, any fish that have those, you can't treat the virus. You have to treat the symptoms and hope for the best. So there were things like, so that was the reason why we breed the angel. And then we had things like all the live bears would frequently come in with flukes, like gill flukes. They're all raised in huge outdoor ponds. Great life for them until they get shipped. And then because they're outdoors, they're exposed to these parasites, right? And then they don't recover from that. But the ones that are, let's say they give birth en route, or like you put them in a tank and the next day they give birth and they die. But those babies that are raised up do fine. They're great. So they would raise all the swordtails, mollies, platies, guppies, blue rams that don't ship well at all. So those are like the ones that would be raised in house, and they're also, on top of being hard with the shipping and just not pulling through very well. The other thing is that if it's a fish that every pet store needs to have, then we're gonna have them, you know, and we're gonna make sure that they're as healthy as possible by breeding them.
Yeah, I think I'm definitely gonna jump on and see if I can if this pet store, and it was Pierce Pets, correct?
Pruss
Pets. Pruss Pets. Okay.
Preuss Pets. People I've heard call Prius Pets.
Prius Pets.
Heard it all.
At least I didn't say Prius Pets.
No.
But hey, it's you may get in a little trouble with that one with the fine folks at Toyota. So Pruss Pets, I definitely want to go on like YouTube and Facebook and see if they put up any videos of their quarantine room, or more so their breeding room. It sounds like they'd have some pretty good video content to share with people if they have that up. And so lastly, Heather, you've put together a kind of list of, at a minimum, some things that you highly recommend for somebody to have for a quarantine room for their own personal at-home use. And so you've kind of broken it out into a few different categories of treating parasites and fluke worms, flatworms, bacterial infections. Yeah. So If you want to, do you have that in front of you, or do you want me to read them off to you?
I know it. I know it.
Off the top
I
of
know
your
it by
head.
heart.
There you go.
No, yeah, I shot you an email before we did this talk. But, no, it's, and I thought about it a little further. And if we're looking at like the very bare minimum for the average home aquarist, if you're just gonna have a few community tanks and maybe a few quarantine tanks, because you know, the biggest pitfall for anyone with a community tank is that they don't quarantine their fish. So if you're going to have just a handful of tanks like that, you know, the things that you're going to want to have no matter what, because you're not probably going to be buying fish every weekend. You know, you're probably not going to be, I'm going to buy fish here, I'm going to buy fish here. You're probably going to have one source that you're just, my local pet store is what I buy. And if you're going to want to have some handy meds in case anything disastrous happens, the ones, I think are the top 4 I'd recommend, would be your 2 ick treatments, which are going to be Riddick or Paraguard. And the reason there's 2 is because, and for your specific tanks, you might not need both. If you have no interest in keeping puffers or loaches or, you know, so Paraguard's kind of more mild one that'll be safer for scaleless fish and more sensitive fish. And then your Riddick, I think, is the one that you really, really should have no matter what, because it's a little bit stronger, and I think it really gets the job done. And so those are both great to have. And then because you're gonna see ick at some point. If you're a fish hobbyist, you're gonna see ick. And it's completely treatable, you know. So you just want to make sure you have it on hand. And then the other things that are pretty standard and pretty effective would be nitrofurantoin green. They sell it as Furan 2. A lot of times, I think it's under the API brand, Aquarium Pharmaceuticals. And it's a powder, and it turns the water green. But it's probably one of the most effective treatments for bad bacterial, like really bad infections. If you have an animal with dropsy, that's the only thing I can tell you to try that might work. That being said, dropsy is usually fatal. But so under even for less extreme circumstances, it's a pretty effective antibacterial. And then neomycin in conjunction with that, or just in general, is a good mild antibiotic. And those are the top ones I'd recommend. Now, that being said, I sent you a list with a few others. If you are keeping fish from here, there, everywhere, having something called Prazipo would be really helpful in a lot of cases for killing off things like flukes, external parasites specifically. I know with saltwater, a lot of times people will dip them in Prazi to knock off any flukes and stuff like that. You can always, I think you can do that with freshwater too. Do like a 5-minute dip or so in Prazi, like full strength, and see if anything comes off. But yeah, the other things that you can have and that are also useful for more mild situations would be like Melafix or Pimafix, which are great for, it's something just starting, or I'm not entirely sure this is an issue. There's a few torn fins. It's not red. Put a little bit of Melafix in there. If you're seeing a little bit of fungal stuff going on, it's not super nasty, do Pimafix. If it's really nasty, do Furan 2. And then the only other thing I can think of would be something called Metronidazole, which is great for if you're going to medicate internally, if you're trying to coat the food with some sort of medicine for internal parasites specifically.
Very cool. And again, you have several years of like direct experience in a quarantine room, applying these medicines. And I think your top 4, if we were to price them out, you could probably have like the smallest, amount that they sell, and you'll probably be maybe a $25, $30 investment.
It's not much. Yeah. I want to say the Furan sells for like maybe $10 for like a package with like a handful. I forget how many packets, maybe like 10, 12 packets. I think each one treats like maybe a 10-gallon tank. But yeah, just to have on hand. The Paraguard's inexpensive. Riddick is pretty inexpensive. Metronidazole can be a little bit pricey, and neomycin can be just because you don't get a lot for it. But if you're going to have just a few tanks and you just want to have something on hand in case, it's great.
Yeah, I mean, especially if any of those tanks are community tanks, where as you add fish to a community tank, the dollar signs, your investment into that tank in electricity, in water changes, in food, in the actual price of the fish to purchase, it could add up. So $20-$30 to protect your investment is not it's not that much to ask.
No, not really. No, it's pretty easy, and I think a lot of places carry it. I was in Canada doing talks. So you said in the beginning, I do talks in the U.S. and Canada. Well, I've done my fish health talk there. And the thing is, I think over there you have harder time accessing these, which is worth noting.
I think the EU as well. Yeah, I think in Europe they also have because they're considered medicines. Again, I'm not an expert on why, but I think it falls into a very strict category, and it's banned. Like, it's very difficult for them to get these.
Yeah, but in the U.S., it's fine. I can go to pretty much any pet store and get most of these things, especially, I will say, independent retailers are where you want to go for these things.
Awesome. Well, Heather, thank you so much for all of your insights and sharing all of your experiences that you have. Your beginnings in the hobby, breeding danios, catching wild native fish, and now more recently talking about your experience working in a pet store and sharing your quarantine room experience with us. Lastly, I would say, you do speak at fish clubs and you do take engagement. So if somebody wanted to reach out to you and said, yeah, you're like 1 or 2 states over, or another Michigan fish club, and they want to have you out to talk about any of the topics that you specialize in, what's a good way for somebody to reach out to you? And I can also link it in the show notes.
Yeah. So, well, honestly, probably the best way is Facebook, because I think we all kind of live there sometimes. That's definitely, that's how you reached out to me, so that was really helpful. Otherwise email is great. I was using my University of Michigan email, but I think that's going to end pretty soon. So I'm going to say on the safe side, you can email my MSU, so I'm an alumni, so you can email BURKE. So Burke, HE2 at msu.edu.
And I will have that also in the show notes as well. So just in case you missed that, you can always go in there and find Heather's contact information. And again, as you hear, through this conversation, Heather is a wealth of knowledge. Very, very well-rounded in the hobbies, collect many, many different species. And if you want to have her come and talk about cockroaches or snakes or any of the other critters that she keeps, we didn't even touch on it here. And also, another update with Heather is that she's now working at a pet store or a wholesaler for saltwater, correct?
Correct.
Yep, and so we don't talk much about saltwater here, but it is pretty cool. So she also has that under her belt now. So again, just a fountain of knowledge. Heather, thank you so much. I really appreciate it and hope to have you back on soon, okay?
All right, thank you.
All right, have a good night, Heather. What a wide-ranging interview with Heather Burke. If you have any influence in deciding who gets to speak at your club, I would strongly recommend you consider inviting Heather to come speak about breeding danios, collecting native fish, or fish health. How often do you get to have someone as accomplished at such a young age as Heather? Having her in your speaker lineup will certainly let your club see that the hobby is alive and well with the younger generations. That does it for this episode, so get involved in your local fish club, help grow this wonderful hobby, and have fun with other fish nerds.